I always figured quiet out here would be enough to keep trouble away. 40 acres of open land, a winding creek that cuts right through it, and a handmade bridge that stood strong for 2 generations. That was my piece. The bridge wasn't just wood and bolts. My father built it with his own hands back in the 70s, long before subdivisions started popping up like mushrooms after rain. He used reclaimed timber from an old barn and carved our family name into beam that arched over the walkway. I rebuilt it after the floods of '04, adding a steel base underneath, a nod to my trade, and a promise to keep it standing. That land, that bridge, it was home. Not just a house, not just a view, but the bridge. My grandkids call it Papa's Trail, and we'd walk it every Sunday, rain or shine. It connected the back pasture to the woods, a shortcut we all loved, a memory maker. When the new HOA formed 3 years ago, I didn't think much of it. They stuck to the new houses on the South Ridge, about a half-mile from my place. I never signed their agreement. Didn't have to. My land predates their bylaws by 50 years, and besides, I'm a sitting federal judge. I know my boundaries, and theirs. So when I got home one Thursday to find my bridge in pieces, timber floating down the creek like some backwoods war zone, I didn't feel confused. I felt something deeper, a bone-deep rage. Someone had trespassed, vandalized federal protected property, my property. And right there, as I stared at the ruin, I knew something the HOA didn't. They just made the worst kind of mistake. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this one's gonna sting. The note was duct taped to the fence post, flapping in the breeze like it had something to say. But it didn't say enough. Just a half-crumpled printout with a smug logo at the top. Property adjustment in accordance with Easement Protocol 5B. Below it, a single sentence. Unauthorized footbridge obstructing community access has been removed by order of the HOA board. No signature. No contact. Just cold, bureaucratic arrogance. I held that paper in my hand and stared at the ruins of my bridge, saw the splintered beams, the gouges in the earth, the muddy tire tracks that ran down from the hillside. That bridge wasn't just sentimental. It was registered as part of the conservation easement I'd personally overseen with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Protected wetland. That creek fed into a waterway that supported dozens of species, and under federal law, any alteration required environmental review and my explicit approval. The arrogance, it shocked me more than the act itself. They didn't knock. They didn't write. They didn't ask. They just tore it down like they owned the place. And I know why. There's been whispers for months about building a walking trail, some glossy plan the HOA cooked up for the newer residents. A trail that, surprise, surprise, ran straight through the south edge of my land. My bridge was in their way, and instead of rerouting the trail or negotiating, they brought in a bobcat and turned 50 years of family legacy into firewood. They thought I was just another old man with land, thought I'd send a complaint and wait in line for someone to take me seriously. They didn't know who I was, but they were about to. I didn't come in swinging. That's not how this works. Not for me. I went quiet, the way a storm does when it's pulling back before it breaks. I made a few calls. First to the county assessor's office, then to the local Department of Natural Resources rep I've known since he was fresh out of grad school. After that, I dialed a number I hadn't used in a while, the federal environmental liaison in Austin. All 3 calls confirmed what I already knew. No permits, no easement modification filings, no environmental impact review, which meant whoever authorized that demolition, they weren't just trespassing. They were in violation of state and federal law. I didn't call the HOA yet. I wanted them to stew a little. I wanted them to think they'd gotten away with it. That Sunday, I took a quiet drive down to their clubhouse, a fancy barn-shaped building with solar panels and patio furniture, so polished it looked like a catalog ad. I didn't say a word, just parked, stepped out in boots still muddy from my land, and walked the trail map they'd nailed to the entrance board. Sure enough, Scenic Creek Trail, with a dotted line right through the spot where my bridge used to stand. I traced the route with my finger, then smiled to myself. They'd planned it weeks ago, maybe months. Inside, I took a brochure off the wall. Enhancing community through connection, It read, bold font, lots of trees. No mention of land rights. No mention of private property. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out my letterhead, the federal kind. I wrote one letter to the HOA board president, another to the county zoning commission, and a third to the Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Office. They thought they'd build a trail. What they actually built was a case file. They responded on Tuesday, not with an apology, but with a veiled threat. An email from the HOA board's land use coordinator, some smug language about cooperative easement interpretation, and how the footbridge posed a safety hazard per Section 14 of the Community Covenant. I almost laughed. My bridge had been inspected 3 times in the last decade, most recently by a state engineer who described it as sturdier than most county overpasses. But sure, safety hazard. The email ended with a line that made my jaw tighten. We look forward to resolving this matter amicably, without the need for unnecessary escalation. I read that part twice. They were trying to box me in, make me the aggressor. A classic move when someone's overstepped and knows it. They didn't know I was already 5 steps ahead. The next morning, I received a call from a wildlife enforcement officer named Jackson. Said he'd reviewed my complaint and wanted to do a walk through the site. When he arrived, his expression said everything before he even opened his notebook. This whole thing's a mess, he muttered, crouching by the edge of the creek. You see this runoff? That's from machinery. They didn't even lay down mats to protect the bank. No sediment barriers, just tore it out and left. He took photos, measurements, noted the trout spawning season, the marsh grass that had been flattened. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. You said they didn't have permission? None. I said, not from me, not from the county, not from the state, and not from you. Jackson looked up from his notepad. Good. Then this just became a federal matter. That night, I sat on the porch, watching lightning crawl along the hills in the distance. A storm was coming, and this time it wasn't mine. By Friday, the tone had shifted. I could feel it in the silence. No more emails. No knocks at my door. Not even a friendly wave from the usual morning dog walkers who'd once smiled from the trailhead near my fence line. That's when I knew the board had gotten wind of what I'd set in motion. Someone tipped them off. Probably the same someone who noticed a fish and wildlife SUV parked on my land earlier that week. But it wasn't just Jackson now. His visit triggered a chain of reviews from the Army Corps of Engineers, no less. Apparently, any time a creek-connected structure on protected land is altered without proper review, it sets off alarms in a dozen different departments. And now, they weren't just looking at the bridge. They were looking at the whole trail. Meanwhile, I'd started hearing whispers. A neighbor I barely knew, Frank from the edge of the subdivision, stopped me at the co-op Saturday morning. Hey, just so you know, he said, voice low. They're panicking. Board called a closed-door meeting. Heard them talking about retroactive permits, trying to clean it up on paper. I just nodded, let them scramble. But I wasn't done. I called in a favor from a friend who works in the appellate clerk's office. We pulled the HOA's articles of incorporation and charter, took a hard look at their expansion clause, and wouldn't you know it, their jurisdiction stops 400 feet shore of my creek. Everything they'd done was not just unlawful. It was outside their legal footprint entirely. I printed that section, highlighted the lines, and sent it certified to every board member, with a personal note attached. You didn't just tear down a bridge. You tore into federal land. And that's a problem. The real twist came a few days later, on a rainy Wednesday morning, when I received a call from my colleague at the federal court, a clerk who's worked with me for years, someone who knew the ropes of both the legal world and what I liked to do with the power I held. He sounded almost too calm as he asked, "Did you have something to do with the HOA's sudden pause on the project?" I didn't even have to ask. I knew what he meant. The call wasn't about me being a judge. It was about the real leverage I had, and how badly they were about to feel it. "They're scrambling, boss," he continued. "Try to file a motion in your district court this morning, claiming the creek's too troubled for conservation status, that the bridge is a remnant structure with no historical value. You know, try to rewrite it as something easier for them to deal with." I laughed. feeling the satisfaction rise in my chest. They thought I wouldn't catch the subtle swipe at my father's work. They thought they could bulldoze my family history and just call it remnant, a relic. I already took care of it, I said, feeling a grin pull at my lips. Filed a request to block any changes to the land. They'll have to come through me before they mess with anything. There was silence on the other end. You've got the right to block them, sure. But you might want to sit tight. They're going to come back hard. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just fighting for the bridge. I was fighting for a principle, the very principle of ownership and respect that every landowner should have. If I let this slide, it'd set a precedent for every other HOA in the state. And that I couldn't allow. I figured they'd lawyer up, and they did. A manila envelope showed up via courier, stamped with some boutique firm's name out of Austin. The kind of place that charges six figures just to write stern letters on crisp, watermark paper. The letter inside was exactly what I expected. Legal jargon dressed up to sound righteous. Unintentional encroachment. Good faith effort to improve community access. Presumed easement permissions under Public Interest Development Clause. And then the kicker, they were asking me to settle for the destruction of a protected bridge on my property without notice. I read it twice, then laid it gently on the counter like it might stain the wood if I wasn't careful. I wasn't mad anymore. I was insulted. So I did what I do best. I responded. A single-page letter, typed on official stationery, signed with my federal title. Not a threat, a promise. I cited the Clean Water Act. I listed the statutes regarding protected wetlands, historical structures, and unpermitted land alterations. I included the fact that they'd sent workers without verifying property boundaries, which I knew, thanks to my trail cam footage of the contractor's truck license plates. I closed it with one line. The law is not a suggestion. Your client has violated it on multiple fronts. The next day, I filed an injunction to halt all development related to the HOA's trail. I submitted documentation of environmental damage. I sent copies of everything to the state attorney's office and to the Environmental Review Board. Then I called Jackson, the enforcement officer, and asked him for a formal statement to support the filing. He didn't hesitate. They'd turned this into a legal chess match. Problem was, I was the one who wrote the rule book. They didn't show up in person. Of course they didn't. The HOA president sent a proxy, some young lawyer with slick hair and a folder full of excuses. We met in a small federal hearing room just off the courthouse annex. The kind of place meant for real disputes, not petty suburban land grabs. I didn't wear the robe. This wasn't a matter for the bench. But I was seated across from the magistrate, and when the clerk read out the case details, my name and title landed like a hammer. The HOA's lawyer looked up, surprised. He knew right then that the game had changed. I kept my voice even as I presented the facts. Photos of the destroyed bridge. The footage from my trail cam showing their hired crew crossing onto my land without permission. Satellite images confirming the property lines. And then the environmental reports, sealed and certified, showing disruption to a protected riparian habitat. The Clean Water Act violations alone were enough to put their little trail plans on ice for a decade. Their attorney tried to shift blame, said the board misunderstood the boundary lines, claimed the demolition was an honest mistake. The magistrate raised an eyebrow. A mistake carried out with heavy equipment, on federally registered land, without due diligence. The room went quiet, and then came the part I'd been waiting for. The magistrate turned to me and asked if I intended to pursue civil damages. I paused, let that hang in the air. Yes, I said, calm, certain, for property destruction, trespassing, and environmental harm. And I'd also like a permanent injunction against any further activity on or near my land by the HOA, its board members, or any affiliated contractors. They didn't have a response. Not one, because there wasn't one to give. Word spread fast after that hearing, not just within the HOA, but across the entire subdivision. Folks who'd once waved politely from the trail started crossing the street to avoid eye contact. Some still nodded. A few even apologized. One older couple stopped by with a pie and said they never knew what the board was really up to. I didn't need apologies, but I appreciated the gesture. Not for me, for the legacy they thought they could stomp over. A week later, I received the official judgment in writing. Injunction granted. Civil case pending. Environmental enforcement under federal review. It was more than a win, it was a warning. The bridge may have been made of wood, but the foundation it stood on was granite, and now they all knew it. Funny thing, the very next morning, a crew showed up again. Same company that tore it down. But this time, they weren't carrying chainsaws. They had measuring tape, gloves, and a stack of replacement lumber strapped to their trailer. I watched them from the porch, arms crossed, as the foreman walked up to my fence line. "We've been hired to rebuild the bridge, sir," he said, eyes low, same as it was, plus some reinforcement. I didn't respond at first. Just let the silence stretch until he looked up. Then I said, "You touch 1 inch beyond that creek bed, and I file an immediate contempt motion." He nodded fast. "Yes, sir. We've got new maps, county verified." And so they worked, quietly, carefully, piece by piece. My father's bridge came back to life. Not perfectly. You can't undo that kind of damage, but close. Close enough that my grandkids could run across it again, that I could walk it in peace, and that the HOA would remember it with regret, not pride. The morning after they finished the rebuild, I walked the bridge alone. Fog was still rising off the creek, clinging to the grass like breath. I stepped slow, letting each board creak beneath me, the way they used when my dad walked ahead of me with a fishing pole slung over his shoulder. I stopped at the center, where the initials he carved into beam had been restored. Slightly darker wood, but the same letters, the same story. This wasn't just about timber or title lines. It was about the illusion of power, about people who think that because they sit on a board or print newsletters or throw around words like community good, they get to rewrite the rules. They forget that not every man with a porch and a pasture is powerless. They didn't know they'd picked the one person who could fight them with more than fists or fury, someone who could outright them, outmaneuver them, and make them answer for every inch they trespassed. The civil case went through quietly. They settled, covered the full cost of the damage, paid a fine to the environmental agency, and agreed in writing to never set foot on or around my property again. The HOA president resigned 2 weeks later. They called it health-related, but everyone knew better. The trail project? Scrapped. Maps pulled. Brochures shredded. The creek runs quiet now. The bridge standing like it always has, maybe stronger than before. And every time I cross it, I remember what that land cost my father to keep, and what it cost me to defend. So if you've got something worth protecting, whether it's an old bridge, a patch of woods, or your family's name carved into a beam, don't wait for someone to hand you permission. Stand your ground. Because out here, if you don't, someone else will build over it.